I'll agree with you on that. There's no issue with that.
Please be seated. The Royal Commission on Antisemitism and Social Cohesion is now in session.
Commissioner, I call Professor Adrien Cherney.
Yes. Professor, will you take an oath or make an affirmation?
Oath is fine.
Thank you.
Stand and attention and put your hand on the Bible. Do you swear by Almighty God the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I say I do.
I do.
Yes, do take a seat. Thank you.
Professor Cherney, you have prepared a report for the Commission dated 31 July 2026, correct?
That's correct.
And do you have a copy of that there with you?
I do.
And to the extent that report expresses opinions, are those opinions that you still hold?
They are.
And to the extent it refers to facts, are those facts that you believe to be true?
That's true, yep.
Commissioner, I tender that report, which is EWR.599.001.0248.
Yes, the report will be received as an exhibit.
Professor Cherney, you are currently a professor in the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
And a former Australian Research Council Future Fellow.
That's right.
And that work of yours focused on case-managed interventions targeting convicted terrorists and those at risk of radicalisation.
Yes, that fellowship primarily focused on those types of interventions.
But your research in general has focused on a range of matters, including evaluating programs designed to prevent and counter violent extremism.
That's correct.
As well as identifying risk factors associated with radicalisation.
Yes, and that's been through the development of the PIRA dataset.
I'll come to ask you about the PIRA dataset in a moment. And your work has involved in the past evaluating existing CVE programs from time to time.
Correct.
As well as assessing the validity of a particular risk assessment tool used in CVE programs.
Yes, we've just completed a study on the VERA-2R.
And you have in the past received a range of Australian Research Council funding and other government funding for your work.
That's correct.
Now, in terms of the instructions you received for the purposes of preparing this report, you were, amongst other things, asked to identify what you consider to be attributes of best practice when it comes to countering violent extremism programs in Australia, correct?
That's correct.
And I'll ask you about those attributes shortly. You were also provided with witness statements and a range of documentation regarding CVE programs at the Commonwealth level and in New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia and South Australia.
That's correct.
And you were asked to assess whether on that documentation the programs met the best practice criteria you had identified.
That's right.
And I'll come to those principles of best practice and how they apply to those programs shortly. You were also asked to explain what you consider to be the risk factors when it comes to identifying someone vulnerable to violent extremism, correct?
That's correct.
And I might ask you a few questions about that topic first before I get to best practice approaches. Now, at paragraph 62 of your report, you describe your examination of the PIRA database, the profiles of individual radicalisation in Australia. Could you just start by explaining what the nature of that database is and how it was compiled?
So it's a database that is modelled on the US PIRUS data base. That's the profiles of individual radicalisation in the US. It's an Australian replication of that specific database, and it in particular looks at individuals who are radicalised into violent extremism in Australia. The sources we draw upon for that database are dominantly open sources, whether it be court transcripts, public reporting, etc. There is a public accessible version of that database currently accessible through UQ that covers cases from 1985 to 2023, and it has a quite a detailed code book associated with that database that describes, one, the source hierarchy, decisions around coding, and the types of variables that are captured in the data sets. There's 114 variables across different risk factors, background characteristics, ideological drivers, etc. There are limitations with PIRA because it's based on open access data in relation to gaps in information, but the development of open source databases is not uncommon. As I said, there's open source databases on terrorist attacks, individual radicalisation in the PIRIS in the US. There's also the PIC in Canada, which is a similar replication of PIRIS, which a colleague, Emma Belton, has written a recent paper comparing PIC and PIRIS data. Yep. So it's not uncommon. It's also used to, open source databases have been used to look at school shootings, all different types of political motivated violence. So while there are limitations, they are seen as offering an advantage because, when you're talking about individuals who are radicalised or committed terrorist attacks, it's not like they're an easily accessible cohort to collect research on. So using open access data is one way of gathering information on those individuals and on those types of areas.
And for the purposes of preparing your report, did you conduct a review of the information in that database?
Yes, we did. So we did undertake an analysis of data in PIRA. It was actually an updated version, including 2024 cases.
And what did that review involve?
So it involved distinguishing individuals who we defined as violent and non-violent. There's a particular categorisation that's explained in one of the appendix of how we distinguish violent from non-violent individuals in the data set. And then we did some analysis saying, what are the risk factors that are similar across the two types of groups, but also are there certain things that are different?
And then did you draw upon that information for the purposes of identifying the various risk factors that you've outlined in your report?
Yeah, for that section from paragraph 62 to paragraph 74 was where we mainly drew upon the PIRA data.
I see. And then in a subsequent section, you examined the relevant literature.
Yeah, we examined the relevant literature more broadly and sort of talk to and point out the sort of similarities with our PIRA data set, but also then making some conclusions around what distinguishes violent to non-violent. What factors distinguish violent and non-violent individuals who are radicalised?
Yes. And so coming back to your analysis of PIRA then, at paragraph 66, you note that the results that you obtained indicate a higher likelihood of risk factor prevalence amongst violent and non-violent individuals. They do not demonstrate causation.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate on that point?
Yeah, so it's this whole argument, correlation doesn't equal causation. While there may be the presence of certain risk factors, we can't say for sure they're causal. You can only really do that with proper longitudinal data. So we're simply demonstrating a relationship or an association that these risk factors are present when it comes to violent and non-violent individuals. Are they the primary cause or a driver of that behaviour? We can't demonstrate that. We can certainly say they're quite they're significant based on our analysis, but are they the main cause in leading to someone mobilising to violence? We can't say for sure, but it certainly is indicative of a general pattern of behaviour. But that's a weakness with any type of this type of research where you're just looking at relationships. You're talking at associations between particular variables. It's just the nature of the limitation of the data, but any type of social research or survey data, etc., as well. So it's not exactly uncommon.
I see. And then in table 1, which is on page 24, appearing just above paragraph 68. Have you here sought to summarise the particular risk factors that you identified?
Yeah.
And so could I just ask you to explain this a little? You have three categories, individual, social and environmental, in terms of the risk factors. And then the first column says radicalisation markers, general vulnerabilities. What does that heading signify?
That means that these general vulnerabilities were present across violent and non-violent individuals.
I see. And so in terms of individual markers, they include deep personal or group grievances,
Correct.
an adult criminal record and mental illness.
Yeah.
And those were present across both violent
Both,
and
yeah,
non-violent,
yeah,
as you've said. All right. And then in terms of social markers, they included having a radical friend, radical family member or radical significant other.
Correct.
And in terms of environmental, that included general consumption of radical online content and social media engagement.
Correct.
And I might come to ask you a bit about some of those shortly. And then in terms of mobilisation triggers in the next column, could you explain what that heading
So that
signifies?
this relates to those factors that we found were highly significant amongst violent individuals, as defined in PIRA.
I see. And so the individual ones included deep ideological commitment, anger, minor, juvenile record.
Correct.
And the social ones included joining a formal network or cell or insular clique membership. And the environmental ones included triggering events. And I'll ask you a little more about that shortly. So starting with social media, you address that at paragraph 69 of your report, and you note that the data confirmed that social media is a universal accelerant in the process of radicalisation, regardless of whether an individual is defined as violent or non-violent, with patterns of social media activity similar across both groups. Could you just explain what you mean by accelerant?
Well, it wasn't a factor to distinguish those between those who mobilised and those who did not mobilise to violence. When I accelerant, it reinforces, for example, it might be group grievances or individual senses grievances, or it might reinforce particular ideological beliefs where they are shared online and they can reinforce those ideological beliefs. So that's really what we mean by accelerant. And while there is a lot of concern around the role of social media, I think it is an important consideration, particularly when it comes to young people. For sure, we cannot discount it's important. In our data, it didn't really distinguish those between those who were violent and non-violent, and it wasn't a predictor of violent behaviour in that sense, statistically, how we analyse the data. But it's not to discount its importance.
And can I ask, given the PIRA database captures information from 1985 to 2023, and given social media has only been taken up, I suppose, more recently at a broader scale, could that timing affect your assessment of its significance in this regard?
That is correct, and that is an observation of the weakness of the data set.
I see.
And a desire for us to update it, of course, with more recent cases. So yes, you're exactly right. But that just points to the limitations of the data set itself.
And that's why you've sought to supplement it with the literature review.
That's correct.
And I'll come back to what the literature says about social media shortly when we get to that section. You also noted at paragraph 74 that contextual and environmental factors play an important role in understanding the risk of radicalisation, and you note a strong association with a triggering event linked to local or real world political or social events. Can you just elaborate on what you mean by a triggering event there?
Just before I answer that question, so there is it's a 100+ page code book that goes into detail each of the particular variables we capture and the conditions under which we capture them and what sort of information is required. So I mean, I'm not going to have the time to go into how that is explained, right? In how we our explanation of each variable, right? And to some degree, you've got to remember, we had a team of people creating this database, and they were looking at the data and coding, and we did checks for intercoder reliability. So there's quite a complex process under which a decision is made as to whether a particular variable characteristic is present, and we check for the consistency under which that under which information is applied to a particular variable to check that that's being done in a similar way. So, you know, there is a certain level of subjective judgment in those decisions as to whether a particular risk factor is present or not based upon the information available, okay? But in relation to a triggering event, in PAR in our code book, it refers to maybe an event by government or an event by an official. The best example I can give you is, for example, there were a number of cases where the individual's passport cancellation was clearly a triggering event in them radicalising and committing an act. So that is an example. It could be a triggering event like a government action, etc. So there's a range of criteria that we use to encompass that.
I understand.
And just one thing, remember, it's not the triggering, as I say in my report, the issue is not the triggering event itself, it's the interpretation of that event. So, yeah, you could say that having an individual having their passport cancelled may be quite legitimate from the point of view of the police, for example, but it's the interpretation of that event by the individual that matters here, that may create an emotional response of anger in reaction to that event itself. So it's really we're not saying we're not making a judgment about the legitimacy of the event itself, but rather the reaction to the triggering event.
I see. And then when you come to the literature review, which starts from paragraph 75, you note at paragraph 81 that the literature suggests that key motivational factors tend to focus on the role of grievances,
Correct.
which you say are a central theme in the literature. Could you just explain what the literature demonstrates on that topic?
Yes, so grievances, there's a few. The level of consistency in the literature, of course there's differences let me start again, sorry. One of the most consistent findings from the research is the role of grievances in social networks. It's perhaps one of the most consistent two findings from the research. So grievances are basically about a sense of injustice over an event. An individual has that, and that's what's driving their behaviours or their beliefs. We found it as in the PARA data set, it was a uniform risk factor. Grievances are about individual grievances, a belief that an individual's group is under threat and has been subject to an injustice. In PARA, we also look at group level grievances as well, where there's a perception that the group is being targeted or unfairly victimised. So that's how we categorise grievances. It's about a sense of injustice, being unfairly targeted. And yeah, it is one of a key driver in both in our data set generally, across violent, non-violent, and also within scholarship more generally. And I can think of the work of Emily Corner, who's done some work around grievance-filled extremism, etc. as well, in highlighting that finding in particular.
And in this section, aside from risk factors, you've also identified what the research suggests about protective factors that mitigate the risk of violent extremism. In particular, at paragraph 83, you note that these include stable employment, higher education, strong family relationships, and pro-social engagement. What do you mean by pro-social engagement?
So that could be pro-social engagement in sports, pro-social engagement with non-delinquent peers, non-radicalised peers, pro-social engagement around school, etc. Those sorts of common activities that we all participate in, that gives us a sense of belonging and purpose.
Yes.
Simply outside of work, so to speak. That's the easiest way I can put it.
Yeah. And then at paragraph 86, this is where you return to the role of social media based on the literature review, and you've noted that social media and broader internet engagement are widely recognised as important risk factors in contemporary radicalisation processes, particularly in relation to several recent cases involving what's termed nihilistic violent extremism. Could you explain what nihilistic violent extremism is?
So, I'll just go to, so on paragraph 98, I go into some detail. So nihilistic violent extremism, you would have heard the term quite often in this form around unclear, mixed, celibate ideologies. You've got that. You've actually heard that from other people. Nihilistic violent extremism is another way of categorising that, but there's some unique features about it. So it is particularly relevant to young people, and that's within nihilistic cases. Most of them involve youth. I think Steve Barracosa touched on this as well. He's seen that in his case file information. So there's no clear ideological alignment as per se. The young person may be engaging with all extreme content. So this could be Islamist, far left, gore material. It could be child sexual exploitation material. Some of the content, if I was to tell you what it involved, it's not very pleasant. We're talking animal cruelty, etc. It could be a whole raft of extreme, in inverted commas, content. And it's more about performative violence, more about the engagement in performative violence and the consumption of that content that matters, less than it being aligned with a particular ideological belief or social or political outcome, as we commonly associate with, terrorism, for example, or violent extremism. Okay?
I see.
So it's about performative violence, the glorification of violence, but it can, what's the concern? It can involve a certain level of coercion, particularly with online communities where young people are being encouraged or groomed to engage and perform in this particular type of violence. So it can include a certain level of coercion. I'll just note here, of course, the pilot program that South Australia has initiated to some degree recognises that particular phenomena. The pilot program slips my mind.
Yes, I think we heard evidence from a South Australian representative about that.
Coercive online violent extremism pilot, yes. COVI, in essence, recognises that. So they're engaging across all types of extreme content. Now, NVE raises a couple of challenges for CVE. One is around referral ambiguity. If there's no clear ideological alignment, who do you refer them to? I would argue CVE services are best placed to deal with NVE because of their experience of engaging with complex cases. The other challenge as well is with NVE, you can get overlap between victim and perpetrator. So the individual can be both a perpetrator of violence but also a victim, in that they're coerced and groomed to commit that violence, you see? So there's a perpetrator-victim overlap. And that is also very challenging for CVE service provision. There's high intervention complexity with individuals. So cases I've seen and been informed about, you can have young people who are displaying ASD, mental health, child protection issues, family DV context, disengaged from school, making school threats, engaging with misogynistic material. So this creates intervention complexity, trauma, and the big problem and concern is that if you have young people engaging with this extreme content, like animal cruelty, for example, in their formative developmental years, what does that mean for their ongoing development and desensitisation to that material and to that content as they mature? So it creates a real complexity around intervention. It also creates an issue around whether risk assessment tools are relevant to NVE, and also there is a major, one of the key things is support for staff who are working with these cases, because the trauma the carer's trauma experience. So that's NVE, and that's the challenges it presents for CVE.
And at paragraph 86, you refer to a 2017 study in this regard on the topic of internet usage, and that found that individuals typically use internet as a resource once they're already motivated rather than being passively radicalised through online exposure.
Yeah.
Is it possible that given the date of that study, the findings could be a bit different today in the light of increased rate of social media usage, for example, in
Sorry,
the last...
Which paragraph?
In
Which-
paragraph 86.
Oh, 86. Oh, the reference to the Gill study.
2017
Yeah.
study.
No, I mean, I mean, more recent cases with NVE, yeah, definitely. But it's not like I'm not discounting the role of the internet or social media, but it's not like people come down as passively consuming and that is content free. It's like some deterministic, influence it's having on individuals, right? People come with vulnerability to the influence of the content. So if you had a young person who had ASD, no friends, wasn't engaging in school, had mental health issues, poor parental monitoring in the home, and was being bullied, his influence, his degree of influence of social media on him is very different to someone else who doesn't have those sort of risk factors or vulnerabilities. That's what I'm trying to highlight. That's what needs to be highlighted, right? I know there's a lot of talk, and about social media and etc. with the social media under 16 ban, etc. But this stuff isn't just being. They're not just seeing this stuff on X or Blue Sky. They're going into the dark web. This is where this real gore material is being accessed, right? So there's a certain limitation to sort of mainstream social media. I'm not saying it's not valuable. Social media responses, but yeah, it's not some sort of passive influence. And also, while young people, there's a lot of work around saying, and I'm not doubting this, that young people are vulnerable in the sense they can be groomed, coerced, and influenced online by others, right, other third parties, and that's true, but some young people have a certain level of agency in this. They're actually creating content. They're not just being passively victimised or passively groomed. They're creating content. They're being active in the creation. There is a certain level of agency around young people. So, it's more complex than saying, well, it's all social media's fault, right?
I see. Can I then ask you about the role of ideology, which
Yep.
you address from paragraph 95 of your report? And at paragraph 96, you noted that across different ideologies, anti-Semitism plays a cross-cutting and unifying element. Could you
Yes.
speak to that point, please?
Yeah, so it's one of the I suppose it's a particular belief system that overlaps across a broad spectrum of clear ideological beliefs is generally anti-Semitism. It's one of the unifying characteristics of all form of violent extremism or violent extremist ideology is anti-Semitism. That would be a true observation to make.
Yeah, and here you've come back to this point about the fact that in paragraph 97 that not all individuals referred to or engaged by CVE programs will align neatly with a single identifiable extremist ideology, and so programs have to account for that.
For that, yeah. So you can have individuals, and NVE is a classic example of that. There could be amalgam and mixed, etc. There can be contradictory positions. There can be no coherency. So yeah, there may not be. In some cases, there may not be a clear ideological alignment. Oh, they're aligned with Salafi jihadism. Oh, they're a neo-Nazi. Oh, they're a far left. You can have Salafi jihadism overlapping with far left beliefs around capitalism, etc. So it can be an overlap, right? So there may not be any. In some cases, there may not be that clear alignment.
And speaking generally of the programs you assessed, is it your view that overall they are catering for those circumstances of mixed, unclear ideologies?
Yeah, there was a recognition of the need to do that in a number of programs, like with the South Australian Initiative, and with the Victorian Initiative, etc., the Victorian Police Initiative, and also with the correctional environment. They're recognising the need to move beyond, clear ideological alignment being a core referral criteria, and that recognises, that's generally recognising the nature of violent extremism and what's been argued in the literature and what's been shown by the research.
And then could I then move on to ask you about the role of religion, which you address from paragraph 101.
Yeah.
And you express the view that both scholarship and policy must take claims seriously to the when those who are engaging in violent extremism claim that they're being motivated by their own interpretation of a certain religious text.
Correct.
And you go on to say at paragraph 102 that the influence of religion in these contexts is not contingent on theological depth or engagement or doctrinal sophistication. Rather, what matters is the emotional salience and personal significance of religious beliefs. Could you just expand on that?
Yeah, that's
please?
true. Like, I know this is a fraught area. It's controversial. It's fraught. It's not very. It's pretty much an uncontested area in academia, right? But more broadly, socially and politically, of course, with Salafi jihadism or Islamist extremism, you know, the people always at pains to say this has nothing to do with religion, which is fair enough, but it's analytically reductive because individuals can be influenced by religious beliefs. I mean, it gives them a moral identity, it gives them a moral framing, and it's not about theological understanding. It doesn't matter how complex, they don't have to have read the Quran. I mean, you know, years ago, I remember I did a work for New South Wales Corrections on the prison intervention, and I went into prisons and interviewed individuals who were participating in prison. Prison no longer exists, it's been amalgamated under the service delivery model. And I remember speaking to one individual, one young guy, about his participation in the interventions. I asked him, what did you learn? And he said to me, well, and he was arrested with a group of individuals. They were praying together, socialising together. They weren't part of a mainstream mosque, and they were engaging online and engaging with ISIS recruiters and all this crazy stuff, right? And I asked him, what did you gain from the intervention? He says, well, when I came into prison, it was the first time I read the Quran, right? And I knew that my understanding, he goes, yeah, and I said, oh, really? So what did it teach? He goes, oh, well, you know, I came to realise that my understanding around jihad wasn't all that accurate. That's the example. It didn't matter. He still had that in the group. They still had that religious belief that they were defending Islam, right? So it doesn't matter about, they don't have to engage religious texts, but the religious belief still has some saliency for them emotionally, as the group sense of identity. So no, it's not about theological sophistication or religiosity as we define it as such.
And in terms of what that means for the design of CVE programs, you go on at paragraph 106 to say effective responses should include direct but nuanced engagement with ideological beliefs, particularly where these beliefs legitimise violence. In saying that, does the same approach apply, in your view, to those who might have these misguided interpretations of religious texts, that there should be nuanced engagement with those views as part of CVE programs?
That's correct, yeah.
I see. And can at that point I ask you about a particular program that you have addressed in your report, which is the CIS program in Victoria, which you've referred to from about paragraph 183. You describe that as a program that targets young people and adults who've become radicalised into religiously motivated violent extremism, in this case Islamic-inspired extremism. And you've noted at paragraph 184 that the Board of Imams Victoria plays a role in the delivery of that program. And then at paragraph 185, you've noted about halfway through that model incorporates elements of ideological and religious appraisal, correct?
That's correct.
And at that point, could I then ask you about a particular published article which addresses that program, which is called Ideology and Cognitive Complexity in Terrorism, Insights from a Terrorist Rehabilitation Program, which was published in August 2025 and authored by, among others, Sheikh Mustafa Sarakibi. Do you have a copy of that article there with you?
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we can bring that up on screen as well. While that's happening, could I take you to page 7 of that article under the heading Community Integration Support Program?
There is no page 7.
Do you have numbers in the top right? Number 7?
Oh, I see, sorry. Right, I get it, yep.
About halfway down the page, it notes that the program provides holistic support to participants utilising a diverse team of staff, including religious mentors, that is community imams, case managers, clinical psychologists, a reintegration officer who supports the transition from prison to community, and a family support officer. Does that accord with your understanding of the program?
Yeah, it provides a type of wraparound support with different individuals playing a role in a person's intervention plan. Yep.
And it notes in the next paragraph, participants in the CISP have some agency in steering the type of support they receive from the program, and goes on to say most have a desire to pursue their Islamic knowledge through one-on-one time with an imam. That accords with your understanding?
Yes, it is, yeah.
And that sort of engagement with a religious mentor, do you see that as being a useful way to address the situation of a person who may be motivated by misguided interpretations of religious texts, for example?
Yes, if it's relevant to their needs, for sure. I mean, that judgment of whether they might involve a religious mentor would have to be based on a needs assessment and also a risk and need assessment, and also around what their intervention goals could be. But if it's deemed relevant, yes, it would make a lot of sense.
Yes. And then could I take you to page 14 of the article? That number appears in the top left. And it notes that under the heading ideological reappraisal, that the experiences of many CIS participants demonstrates that central to some terrorist rehabilitative efforts is a re-expansion of individuals' cognitive complexity through a process of ideological reappraisal and the acquisition of intellectual humility. Is that the sort of outcome you're envisaging when you talk about nuanced engagement with individuals, as you have in your report?
That's correct, because in my report I talk about overcoming rigid binaries, black and white thinking, etc. That's basically what they're trying to attempt here.
I see. And it goes on to give some examples of how individuals' views have been impacted as part of this program. So on the same page, under the heading Doctrinal and Relational Re-expansion, it notes, for example, the notion of responsibility, once restricted to an individual obligation of jihad, is enlarged to include a wider responsibility to community and family.
That is correct. And what is interesting is that finding also accords with research in the Indonesian context. So I had a PhD student from Indonesia who interviewed former terrorists in the community, and it's the exact same ideological reappraisal. They reinterpret their religious beliefs, right? It's not that they're abandoning them, because this is it's important emphasis that Mustafa makes in a number of articles, 2 articles on this. They're not abandoning their religious belief, they're reinterpreting them. And one they reinterpret that is their sense of obligation to family, and that's been consistently found elsewhere as well.
And it can also involve, as noted further along in this paragraph, redefining how to respond to
Yeah.
grievances without recourse to ideologically mandated violence. And one participant noted, injustices exist all over the world. They, that is the imams, taught me that I could still feel
Yeah.
that injustice, but I could choose how to respond to it. When the imam said what I was doing was violent, it was an insult to me. Now I look at it and it's grotesque what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And further on in this article, on page 20, in the second paragraph that starts on that page, it's noted what became clear through the research was that participants on the CISP achieved intrinsic ideological change through the process of being provided more knowledge, more context, more guidance, more care and respect, and more time, allowing the participants to be vulnerable and to examine the ideas and beliefs that had led to their crimes. Does that have a parallel in the research that you've observed?
Yes, it does. It's focused on the process of ideological reappraisal. That's what's being emphasised there, and that's consistent with the research as well, as to how you get a shift in it's one way in which you get a shift in behaviour.
I see.
And yeah.
And going back to paragraph 188 of your report, you noted there that the available outcome and impact data indicate that this program has been effective in addressing risk factors and strengthening protective factors associated with disengagement from violent extremism.
Yeah, based on the published material, based on the documents that I reviewed that were provided by Victoria, they were very comprehensive. Both the client intervention plans and the independent evaluation. Yeah, it shows a level of effectiveness in reducing those risk factors. Yeah.
And indeed, you went on to conclude that this program was consistent with all the elements of best practice that you had identified, and I'll ask you some more about those criteria shortly.
Yeah, of all the programs reviewed, it was the one that was consistent across all criteria. But again, I mean, that was largely a result of the comprehensiveness of the documentation as well.
I see. Now, can I then ask you again on this topic of challenging beliefs, including those that may be religiously inspired, in relation to the engagement and support program in New South Wales? You've noted at paragraph 160 that while that program is described as a disengagement initiative and not a deradicalisation program, and while it says, I think in Ms Jackson's statement, that they don't directly seek to challenge beliefs, you've expressed the view that it does in fact address ideological, cognitive or belief-related issues through intervention activities. Could you just explain how you formed that?
Yeah, well that was based upon the types of supports that were being provided, with counselling, psychological support, etc. So yeah, look, this issue of whether they describe a program as derad or disengagement, look, I can understand why certain agencies at a formal level are describing their programs as disengagement initiative, because, you know, I said in my report, it makes sense. You know, they don't want to be seen to be telling people how what to believe. You know, the state telling you should believe this, etc., sort of thing, right? But really, which is I'm not semantically nitpicking here any of the submissions or the agencies, right? But there is to get behavioural change, you have to get cognitive change, right? If one's going to moderate their beliefs about the use of violence and no longer see violence as justifiable, you're going to have to. There is a cognitive shift, right? So the interventions do by default focus on ideological change. Some may directly do it, like CISP. Others may indirectly do it, like ESP. But there is still an emphasis on on getting some shift in cognition, in beliefs, or
And
the rigidity.
it might depend on the form of ideology that you're dealing with, because to take one example given to us by a representative of New South Wales, it's possible that a person with white supremacist thinking might continue to believe white people are superior to other people, but no longer be motivated towards violence, whereas if one believes that it is one's religious duty to kill non-Muslims, difficult to see how one moves away from violence without changing that belief. Is that fair?
Look, it's in the look. I want to choose my words very carefully here, without being seen to criticise what the other states have said. There's still, if you had a white supremacist who, denied the Holocaust, the existence of the Holocaust, there would still be some engagement around changing their belief system around that, right? So yeah, look, they may not do it directly. It may indirectly. They may indirectly do it through intervention programs. They may not say you shouldn't believe this, but there has to be an engagement of unpacking their belief systems, of whether the black and white thinking, the attitude towards immigrants, etc. There needs to be that shift. So while I may not explicitly say that's not what they do, and I can understand why that is, right, as I said before, but it is what's going on in practice, right? I mean, I remember one case of an individual, again, who was a neo-Nazi and white supremacist. He went through prison and he was participating in the program. I asked him about his shift. He was fairly high up. He was well involved in the neo-Nazi scene. And I asked him about, what really made you change your mind about, because he was distancing himself from his associates, etc. He was going to get his tattoos removed. He was re-engaging in work, all that sort of stuff. And I said to him, what really made you change? He said, I was a chance encounter with a Muslim. Right? Yeah, changed my belief. So it was a shift in beliefs, right? About his perception of immigrants and Muslims. So it still happens. It still needs to happen, but it may not be as explicit as you need to change or think this way, right? That's the point.
And so it may be through pro-social engagement initiatives, for example, sort of interfaith collaboration that might lead to that shift.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Could I then ask you about the best practice criteria that you've formulated, which do pick up on some of the evidence you've just been giving, and you really explain the best practice criteria from about paragraph 34. And before we get to each of the criteria you've identified, could you just explain how you went about determining what is best practice in this area?
So one way was primarily through a literature review, looking at systematic reviews, in particular looking at the existing work around case managed programs. There's a lot of there's work around there as effectiveness, but there's also a lot of systematic reviews saying these are the general accepted approaches that would characterise effective programs. It's another question of whether they're effective or not, but this is what we would generally see. That, and also my own work in the space as well, was also influential. So that's the two main sources.
I see. And you have noted in your report that programs should be underpinned by what you describe as a clear theory of change. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
I know like with I can think of with CISP and NI, was it the Victorian program, NITE?
Yes.
They have the PIM model underpinning that. That's Kate Burrell's pro-integration model. That's a theory of change, how you get disengagement. So it's and that is about, it's about working, it's about identifying how the program will have an influence and what are the pathways through it will have an influence. For example, around pro-social supports, etc. I mean, yeah.
And then you go on to note in paragraph 34 this question of voluntariness.
Yeah.
And that the general view is that programs should be voluntary to be effective, based on the premise that mandatory participation is unlikely to produce meaningful cognitive or behavioural change. But then you do note at the end of that paragraph that empirical evidence supporting this claim remains limited, and some research suggests that mandatory participation may also offer certain benefits under specific conditions. What sort of conditions are you referring to there where mandatory participation may be appropriate?
Well, may be beneficial under someone who's very reluctant to engage with intervention providers. I mean, some support is better than no support, right? Even if it's coerced. It could be if they're high-risk individuals, so they might be communicating behavioural intent or threats. But it's really on a case-by-case basis. I think it can be useful if it's used selectively. Ideally, of course, you would want individuals volunteering to participate in an intervention, because that creates the condition of better for behavioural change. They're more open to being challenged, or they're more open to support in a voluntary sense. But if you look at the literature, say on mandated drug interventions, the research shows that even in that context it can have an impact on addictive behaviour. But in this context, it certainly can have benefits if someone is high risk and is unwilling to engage with services. And remember, even if they're coerced under certain circumstances, they may engage in the intervention and actually may shift and think, oh, this is actually quite beneficial. All right? So yeah, I think selectively used, like I know CSOs exist in Victoria, etc.
The support and engagement order?
Or the support and engagement order. As I said, selectively used around risk mitigation, and also, that's the circumstances I would say it would be relevant. But again, as I said, repeat, in a selective context.
I see. And the support and engagement order in Victoria seems to be the only case of an option for a mandatory intervention of this kind in terms of the programs that you surveyed. You're aware that option has never actually been utilised in Victoria?
Correct. Yeah.
Is it your view that something like that should be available in all jurisdictions?
If those jurisdictions deemed it was useful, I think so. I mean, it would depend if it met a particular need, if they thought it was valuable as another toolkit, as another option for high-risk individuals who may be reluctant to engage.
And so, in particular, to deal with that situation where, I mean, given these programs are consent-based, the program may identify an individual who is high risk, and if they don't consent, then of course that program has no mechanism for addressing that risk other than potentially. So Heather Jackson from New South Wales gave evidence earlier in the week that what they might do in that situation is liaise with the party who referred the individual. So, for example, if the Department of Education referred, they'd liaise with the department about that. Do you see that sort of option as, that sort of liaison as sufficient to address the situation, or do you think there should be that mandatory overlay available if necessary?
It would depend on the level of risk the individual has or presents. That would be an assessment that would need to be made by the practitioners using the relevant tools. Again, if they're communicating behavioural intent or behavioural threats, under those circumstances it might be helpful. But again, that would have to be an individual decision based on their structured professional judgment in combination with the appropriate risk assessment tools to make that decision.
I see. Then, in terms of other criteria you've identified for best practice, at paragraph 35, you've noted the importance of clear referral pathways and thresholds, including defined criteria for referring agencies, sources of referral, and intake processes, and importantly that access to programs should not be contingent on ideological alignment, as we discussed earlier. You found that all programs that you assessed met this criteria?
I did, yeah, based on the documentation provided. They did have clear referral criteria and intake criteria. And also criteria around what would happen when someone may not meet a particular threshold, and in some cases things like its ESP, they can be sent to additional services around mental health, etc. But yeah, in relation to referral criteria based on the documentation, it was fairly standard and comprehensive.
Yeah. And in highlighting the importance of programs that aren't contingent on ideological alignment, in saying that you're not downplaying the value of programs like CIS that may have a particular focus on, say, religiously motivated extremism. Of
course, and that judgment would need be made on a risk and need assessment of that particular of an individual. So yeah.
And the next criteria you identified at paragraph 36 was incorporating robust needs and risk assessment processes, and likewise you found that all programs you surveyed met that criteria.
That's correct.
Then at paragraph 37, you've noted that effective programs should develop tailored intervention plans directly informed by the outcomes of those sorts of assessments, and likewise you found all programs you reviewed to be consistent with that element of best practice?
Yes, based on the documentation provided, looking at the intervention plans, etc. Yes, that's true.
I see. Then at paragraph 38, you note family involvement and engagement being a critical component, particularly in cases involving young people. And what type of involvement and engagement are you envisaging there in terms of the family?
Well, it could be additional support provided to the family if they're under stress, for example, welfare or support or mental health support if the family is particularly under stress. They could be drawn in to be a partner, I suppose, or a participant in a young person's intervention plan, particularly given the family context in the socialisation and monitoring of young people. So that it would really be determined by the particular individual's need, young person's need. But it particularly makes sense. You look at Steve Barracosa talks about juvenile, justice. They have heavy family involvement.
We heard some evidence from Dr. Michelle, the Commissioner for Countering and Preventing Violent Extremism in Victoria, that in relation to the voluntary case management program operated by the Department of Justice there, that the family could be engaged even if the individual does not wish to participate, whereas I think Ms Jackson from New South Wales say they don't take that approach. Which approach is preferable in your view?
Look. Again, my comment is a criticism of either of those two programs or either of what those two individuals said. I take the attitude that any family engagement is good, particularly for young people, because of the monitoring and socialisation role the family plays and the reinforcement of behaviours. So yeah, if an intervention program was to assist a family while their son or daughter was not engaged in the program, that could be a good thing in relation to that, how that family might engage and have dialogue with their own son and daughter, right? And how they skill them up to do that. Perhaps they might then become more engaged with the school. So there's a lot of benefits of engaging the family when it comes to youth radicalisation, even though the young person may not consent. But of course, it has to be based on an individual risk and needs assessment, because in some contexts, family engagement may not be a good thing if family members are the source of the radicalisation source, right? That wouldn't be a good thing. That's quite challenging when that happens. But in relation to looking at needs, I think any level of family engagement is good, particularly in the context of youth radicalisation. But again, it's a case-by-case assessment, right, that they're going to need to make.
The next factor you identified was ongoing case management review and monitoring, and most of the programs you met satisfied that criteria.
That's correct.
Then at paragraph 40, you refer to a multi-agency approach being central to best practice. Why do you consider it to be central?
Because when it comes to the development of intervention plan, you're going to need different types of support, and those support may not just be provided by CVE services. It may be forensic or psychological support from mental health. In the case of young people, it may have to be educational support, engaging the school. For adults, it may be support around employment services. So the nature of the needs will require different services to provide assistance, because no one service has the capacity to address all those needs. It's going to be, a holistic approach coordinated together to address an individual's intervention plan. No one service can carry capacity to do that. That's really why it's required.
And then in terms of involvement of community organisations, you've said at one point in your report that where appropriate, community organisations or representatives should be involved. In what sort of circumstances do you consider that to be appropriate?
Well, it might be appropriate where the community is providing a particular type of service or type of assistance that are relevant to an individual's intervention plan. That's where it can be quite applicable. I know there's a lot of talk around, that community organisations and community services should have a defined role within CVE. I don't necessarily agree with that opinion. They only should have a role if relevant to the need of the individual. My concern is if community services and NGOs or whatever have a defined role, that means they carry some level of risk in managing the client, right? And I don't think that's fair on their behalf. I think they should be involved where relevant to meet the needs of a client, but I don't think they should have a defined role within a program, only when it's to meet a particular intervention need, etc., related to, perhaps it could be employment, it could be pro-social activities, sporting clubs, etc., where they might, or religious organisations, or those sorts of things, gyms, around mental health and etc.
I see. And we have heard some evidence in this hearing to date that sometimes people can be deterred if the only intervention they're offered is a police-led intervention. Does that accord with your research?
Okay, so some can be deterred, but it's not that straightforward. Okay, there's research from Europe that individuals are not necessarily deterred by having police run the program. I found when I looked at the interventions, I didn't find that type of evidence, and to some degree, clients were quite happy for the police to be managing the program. Right? There's mixed opinions. I don't think it means a program will be effective. It does create a problem for the police in the context of managing, sort of balancing rehabilitation, assistance with risk mitigation and security and monitoring. But I don't think it necessarily always acts as a deterrent. You've got to remember, some of these clients don't want community members to know they're on these interventions. They'd rather that remain confidential. And also, there is benefit with involving the police, because in some circumstances, individual clients might have very negative attitudes towards the police. It may be part of what's driving their grievances and their sense of injustices around how law enforcement has worked and operated, etc. And so involving the police can change those attitudes. And if I recall, in some of the SIFS work, clients I made this in notes, the comments around Victoria Corrections, the involvement of Victoria Corrections, but changes their attitude around authority figures. So I think it can have some benefits, but it has to be balanced, right? Is what I would say, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with that statement.
All right. At paragraph 41, you refer to effective programs including case conferencing, independent oversight mechanisms, and you refer to disguised compliance. Now, on this topic of disguised compliance, I won't ask you at this stage to give examples by reference to particular programs.
No.
Can we just talk generally about the concept of disguised compliance at the moment? And you say multiple data sources on client progress and participation should be systematically scrutinised and verified. And again, without going to particular examples of data sources you've seen in particular programs, could you just describe generally what you mean by the need to have multiple data sources?
It's just to verify, it's multiple data sources to verify behavioural change in the context of the possibility of disguised compliance. So it's this whole idea they're faking it, right? They're just saying what they want to, what the caseworker wants to hear, right? It's not the issue of disguise. It's not unique to CVE programs. It's something that occurs in all correctional behavioural programs, right? But you need multiple data sources basically to verify the authenticity of what's going on. How I described it in the research we had is that practitioners can't come to their engagement with clients assuming they are distrustful, right? They have to come with a sort of healthy amount of skepticism is how I would describe it, right? And one way is to be fact-checking and verifying some of their assumptions and assessments, and one way you do that is through the use of different data sources to try and triangulate the authenticity of what's going on.
And again, without going to any examples from particular programs, might those data sources include, for example, what the client says or does, as well as the outcome of assessment tools, for example?
What the client is, exactly, multiple the client is saying, what they're actually doing, and also the reporting from services that they're engaging with.
I see. And I should note, no, I withdraw that. The next criteria you refer to is the importance of data collection processes, and then at paragraph 43, the need to have clear criteria as to when a client should be discharged from or exited from a program. Correct?
Correct, based on the documentation. That is correct, yes.
And finally, at paragraph 44, you note there should be clear criteria for assessing compliance and disengagement or desistance outcomes. And so by that, do you mean programs should be setting indicators of what progress or success is for an individual?
That's correct.
And you go on in the next section to describe some of the challenges in terms of evaluating progress. And you note at paragraph 45 that progress with interventions of this kind is rarely linear, and it's common for individuals to experience periods of stagnation, fluctuation or regression over the course of their engagement. Is that one reason why measuring progress is a challenging exercise?
It is, because it's not like they're going to start and end up here. It looks like that. Right? They're going to progress, there'll be step backs. They'll progress, there'll be step backs, right? And that's just the nature of the interventions, right? It's not unique to CVE. It's you could observe that in correctional programs. And I distinctly remember one client we looked at. He was going really well. We had a metric. We measured our 5-point metric of progress. He was engaging with all his intervention goals, going really well. and then it was like this, he disengaged from the program, stopped turning up, everything went awry. And that had nothing to do with the intervention itself. It was the fact that his mother had left him on his own to take care of his two kids, take care of her two kids, right? So there was dysfunction. There was a dysfunction in the home that created the setback. So that had nothing to do with the intervention. That's the thing, is that it's up and down. So there can be things going on, particularly high need clients. When you talk about intervention complexity with young people, you know, there can be things going on in their life that create setbacks that have nothing to do with the intervention. They just have to manage that. So it's not like success is this linear point A to point B. That's the complexity of what we're dealing with here.
I see. Despite those challenges, you note at paragraph 47 that while interventions may not be the primary drivers of change, there's a broad recognition that they play an important facilitative role in supporting and sustaining behavioural shifts. Could you just speak to that point, please?
Yeah, it's this idea of it's assisted desistance. Yeah, so individuals have to come to interventions with a sense of a desire to change, an individual motivation, but they need, getting to that journey also requires some level of assistance. That their belief to change has to be supported, and that's what I'm talking about there. Is that you can't say, well, this intervention had this impact. It's better to look at them as facilitating a shift, right? Evaluating you can only really evaluate causation if you did a randomised controlled trial of CV interventions, and that's you're not going to have convicted terrorists sitting on a wait list, right? That ain't going to happen, right? And ethically, it's really challenging in this space to run randomised controlled trials. You wanted to demonstrate causation, so it's a challenges of trying to evaluate, and so. Yeah, we can't demonstrate causation so that they have a direct effect, but another way to understand is that they're facilitating a shift.
I see. And then you go on from paragraph 51 to set out some indicators that you suggest might be relevant to assessing progress, including cognitive indicators, behavioural indicators, risk and protective factor indicators, social and relational indicators, engagement and responsivity, and program level indicators, as well as longitudinal indicators. Could I just ask you about the last one? What do you mean by longitudinal indicators?
Basically looking at change over time. Yeah. So you're not just looking at change at one point, looking at multiple points across the period individually engages with, and you're mapping that change over time to see how it's tracking. That's what I mean by that.
I see. Commissioner, I'm about to move on to another topic. Is that an appropriate time for a morning tea adjournment?
It is indeed. We're going to take a 15-minute morning tea break, Professor.
Nice.
All right.
Professor Cherney, I then wanted to ask you some questions about Part B of your report, which is where you go on to assess the various programs that you reviewed against the criteria that we were discussing earlier. You explain at paragraph 115 that your aim was not to determine whether these programs were effective in an absolute sense, but to provide a structured and transparent framework for assessing the extent to which the program design, governance and operational practices appeared consistent with the best practice criteria you'd identified earlier, correct?
That's correct. I wouldn't describe my assessment as a formal evaluation. I assessed whether programs aligned with best practice based on the documents that were provided.
I see. As we identified earlier, there was one program, the CIS program in Victoria, that you assessed as being consistent with all best practice criteria, correct?
That's correct.
And of the other programs you considered, they were all consistent with most of the factors we went through before, but there were some cases where you were unable to form the view that they met criteria in respect of family engagement, data collection, disguised compliance or independent oversight, for example.
That's correct.
But you accepted in your report that that could be because of incomplete information before you at that point in time, correct?
That's correct, rather than the absence of that criteria itself. It
I
just
see.
could have been a judgment based upon the lack of information or detail in the submitted documentation.
And you understand there's now a process in place for various jurisdictions to provide you with further documentation in that respect?
That's correct.
And you'll consider that in due course?
That's correct.
Yes. So for that reason, I won't go through all of the instances where you identified the information was insufficient in respect of particular criteria, but I will ask you about some of the recommendations you have made more generally, starting with some recommendations you've made at about paragraph 142 in respect of the Commonwealth's program. So this was in respect of the National Support and Intervention Program that you made these recommendations, correct?
That's correct.
And they included considering developing a structured measure of client progress that captures not only change but also no change, regression and fluctuations in progress over time. And you noted at paragraph 143 that future evaluations could assess whether the intensity and breadth of interventions provided, including the number and type of supports delivered to high-risk clients, are associated with differential outcomes in client progress, engagement and reductions in risk over time. Why do you consider that to be an important feature?
Because we found in some early research looking at to intervention programs here in Australia that the number of engagements had a beneficial impact on people's success and progression. That's why we're making that suggestion.
I see. And at paragraph 144, you suggest examining whether the duration of client engagement influences progress and program completion. So that's a period of engagement as opposed to number of engagements.
That's
is that
correct,
right?
yeah.
And what is the research that you're aware of suggested about duration?
Well, it's not so much whether duration matters, it's trying to work out whether it does have an effect. Okay, is really the issue here. There's no recommendation of how long a program should be delivered for. No research really has highlighted that. It's really about trying to understand in a bit more nuanced detail of the way in which the effectiveness, and one effectiveness is looking at the number of engagements, the period of engagement, the period over which engagement occurs, and whether that has an effect, because it can help inform decisions around when it might be appropriate to exit a client. It could help decisions around whether continuation on an intervention should occur.
I see. Then at paragraph 215, here you express some overall assessments and recommendations, and you express the view at paragraph 215 that your overall assessment, based on the material you had, is that many of the programs are making meaningful contributions towards intended objectives, including disengagement, risk reduction, rehabilitation and integration, correct?
That's correct.
And at paragraph 217, you've noted that a strength of the Australian approach is the existence of a diverse intervention ecosystem spanning community, police, youth justice, corrections and post-release settings.
That's correct, yep.
And then at paragraph 219, you've made various observations about potential areas for improvement, one of which is strengthening evaluation capacity across all jurisdictions. And what do you mean by evaluation capacity there?
Well, I note that the ACL on evaluation is occurring. It's more around ongoing evaluation, embedding that within programs. And developing nationally consistent metrics so we compare outcomes. And also, look, one of the problems, if I can put it that way, okay, is that there's not a lot of public information out there about these programs. So it leads to a certain impression that it's all very secretive and secret squirrel sort of stuff, right? And I think having independent evaluations where people can, where people are allowed to publish results can help with informing the public and other interested parties about these intervention programs. So that is also one of reasons why I've been making that particular recommendation, because a lot of these evaluations stay in-house, and I can understand why, right? But it would be good if there was a more systematic process of communicating program effectiveness and informing the public about these interventions, because there's a lot of them have been subject to independent evaluation. And you can see with SIS there's some publications, so you can do this and really evaluate capacity is one about strengthening the metrics, but also better information provision about for the public, etc., and interested parties about these programs and how they work and etc. Because I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding about DRAD and whether they're effective, etc. And often some people are making claims about the effectiveness or particularly the non-effectiveness of these programs, who really, how can I put this bluntly, don't know what they're talking about because they haven't done the evaluation work, right? So, I think greater transparency in that would help.
Could assist in building public confidence.
Oh, absolutely. I would totally agree with that, yeah.
And I think that you've already mentioned in your previous answer the next point, which is developing nationally consistent measures of climate change.
Yep. Yeah, because a lot of programs do it, like they're using the PIM and etc. So there is a possibility to do that, but a lot of them are sort of assessing it differently. Some are more sophisticated than others. I think it would be valuable to develop a more consistent, nationally agreed metric, in order to assess these programs.
I see. And the next recommendation you've made is strengthening approaches to identifying disguised compliance at 219C.
That's
Yes.
correct. Yeah, again, that recommendation arises from the fact that of the one area where there were gaps in documentation, this was a challenging. It was a challenging criteria to assess in relation to METBEC practice, but being mindful, in a lot of times in the report, I'm qualifying that conclusion, saying, well, it's likely it does because of the presence of these processes, etc. But
Yes.
explicitly, as I said, CIS was the only one that explicitly addressed the material. CIS materials only explicitly addressed it.
I see.
But I think it could be valuable, do we have the processes in place as a matter of reviewing for intervention programs to do, and they may already have those.
And indeed, we've heard some evidence from some representatives earlier in the week about the processes they do have in place for disguised compliance. And then finally, you've noted continued investment in intervention capability.
That's correct.
I understand your role was not to assess whether these programs were sufficiently resourced in order to deliver what they need, but your observation is a more general one that with increased demand for these programs, one needs to ensure that they're properly resourced.
That's correct, and that was a consistent observation across all the documentation. They were pointing to increased demand, increased caseloads, increased complexity of cases, particularly with young people, right? So yeah, I mean, I wasn't going to make a judgment call on funding levels whether that was adequate, because like funding compared to what, right? Anyway, and yeah, there were costings and etc. In the information I was being provided, but the one consistent observation was the increasing caseload, the increasing complexity, and also particularly around youth. And I think that, I think the Commonwealth and the states need to be mindful of that in relation to the timely delivery of interventions, because timing can matter quite significantly in particular individual cases.
Thank you. So, Commissioner, we will at this point, I propose, move to a closed session to ask Professor Cherney some more questions.
Yes.
But prior to that, it may be convenient for the public cross-examination of Professor Cherney to take place, and potentially any public re-examination if that's to occur.
Yes.
And I understand Mr. Bender has some questions to ask
Yes,
of
indeed.
Professor Cherney.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Bender.
Thank you, Commissioner. Professor Cherney, I appear for 7 peak Jewish community bodies. You gave evidence in response to Councillor Sisting's questions about some of the political sensitivities that you perceive government to have about the topic of ideological change when it comes to CVE. You also gave some evidence about the notion that the connection between religion and extremism can be fraught. If a person presents to a program with a belief that their belief system compels them to attack or kill a Jewish person, whether that be because they identify as a Nazi or they identify as a Muslim with extremist views, any effective program would need to feel that it could directly address that belief, correct?
If the belief is influencing their behaviour, yes, I would agree with that statement.
And if there was a risk that if the belief was unaddressed, it may influence their behaviour in a way that could result in violence towards Jewish people, it would be very important to address the belief, wouldn't it?
Look, you can't answer that with yes and no, right? This is the problem, right? I can't answer that with a yes and no response. It depends on how significant the belief system is to their sense of identity, their decision making, etc. So it's not so simple to say yes or no. It really depends on the individual itself. But yeah, look, I go back to my original statement, is that while programs may be described as focused on disengagement, in one way or another they are going to address cognitive change around belief systems. The extent to which they do that will vary by the individual. So it's not simple to say yes or no. It all depends on how significant that belief system is. Okay. Now you're pointing to if the beliefs, if they're moderating, as I said before, if an individual no longer sees violence as justifiable against the Jewish community, you're getting a shift in belief, in ideology, right? So it does. Interventions. I don't want to leave the impression, and nor is it true, that any of these interventions that they're ignoring ideological change. They're not. Okay, they don't. That's the reality. Right? In one way or other, they do that. They're just not explicit in how they describe that as such.
Why should there be any sensitivity about being explicit in directly addressing in a CVE program a belief that Jewish people should be harmed as a result of a person's ideology?
They're not. Look, they're not. Okay, they're not. It's just I'm not going to stand. I'm not going to make Let me think how I can word this. Okay. I'm not going to criticise how particular interventions decide to officially describe or define their focus. I'm not going to do that. Okay. How they decide to do that is a decision for them at a formal level. Okay. It goes back to my original statement, was that they don't intervention. For example, SIF doesn't describe it as itself as a derad program. It describes itself as a disengagement program. That's because the term deradicalisation has a lot of negative connotations within the Muslim community, right? That's just right. So it's just the language that's employed. I don't think we should be. It's just the language that's employed. I don't think we should be concerned that they're not focusing on ideological beliefs. They are. It's just not obviously explicit in how they describe the program, because of sensitivities around not wanting to be seen to be dictating how particular individuals should think. But they are focused on shifts, directly or indirectly. It's just a pragmatic decision. I don't think we should get particularly in a twist or tied up in knots around how the programs operate. If I can rest assured from the documentation I've seen and the client's information, if there is anti-Semitism as a primary belief system within clients, they are going to focus on that in one way or another. It may not do it at the very start, but along the intervention journey, they're likely to do so. How they do so will be a decision for the practitioners themselves.
So is this a fair summary of your answer? Regardless of how the approach might be framed publicly, it is important in the way it's actually executed for the people within the program directly and squarely to address anti-Semitic beliefs that might lead to violence against Jewish people.
That is correct. Yeah, but it's just not how it's described. And it varies by the individual. It can vary by timing. And you've got to remember, I know we're here for a Royal Commission on Antisemitism, right? Okay, but anti-Semitism is only one type of belief in the mix here. I'm not discounting its importance. I'm not discounting how critical it is. It is, and there is a problem, for sure, okay? But in the context of the interventions themselves, it's some individuals, it's one amongst a mix of belief systems. But I can rest assure you that most practitioners and their intervention plans in one way or another are trying to get ideological change. It's just that they're not obviously explicit about it for pragmatic or policy reasons. I don't think, for me, that's understandable. I don't think that's a criticism of what they're doing. It's not. It's pragmatics. And that's what's important here, is pragmatism around trying to engage clients in a meaningful way. You know, that means the program is called one thing, but they're doing something else. I don't have a problem with that, really. It's about the outcome that matters, right?
Thank you. Now, turning to your ultimate conclusions about best practice, it's right that a conclusion that a CVE program is consistent with best practice is different from a conclusion that it's operating effectively, correct?
Yeah, so that's because this is in relation to the task I was asked to do. I wasn't asked to undertake a formal evaluation of the interventions. I was asked to assess, do they align with what we understand as best practice based upon the documents that I was provided. And yet, the assumption is that those criteria followed are more likely to ensure that a program will be successful. However, it doesn't mean it's going to be successful 100% of the time. This is really important, really important. These programs are not going to be foolproof, okay? It's ups and downs, step backs, right? And I don't think we should judge these CVE programs based upon one failed case, etc. Okay, but they're not going to be 100% effective all the time. But back to my original point was that I was assessing the presence of best practice based upon the documents I was provided. It wasn't a formal evaluation of what we call impact.
And when you say impact, you mean the extent to which a program effectively de-radicalises or persuades people to disengage with violent extremism. Is that right?
Yeah, when it look, yeah, decreasing extremist risk, decreasing terrorist risk, yeah, outcomes around disengagement and desistance, but that's not to say the evidence doesn't exist.
Well,
I wasn't asked to do a formal evaluation of is CISP effective, is ESP effective as such. It was, does it align with what we generally understand best practice to mean, which in the literature is likely to increase the effectiveness of the program overall. I didn't make a judgment. I wasn't being asked to make a judgment. Does it decrease levels of terrorism, for example, right? No.
In fact, your evidence is at paragraph 44 that the evaluation of effectiveness is inherently challenging, given the complex and non-linear nature of radicalisation and disengagement.
That's correct. So when you do evaluate, that's what it goes back to my point around having longitudinal measures and having a mix of indicators of what you would look at in the context of participating on an intervention plan. It's not to say you can't measure effectiveness. This is the debate around program evaluation academically around causation, right? But it's not to say the evidence doesn't exist, because you could see it's irrefutable. I mean, the documents provided on CIS, for example, the independent evaluation and the intervention plans, even the intervention plans, other intervention plans I've looked at, and the work I've done, it's irrefutable. They do work for some individuals, but they aren't going to work all the time. That's a really important point, right?
One of the challenges in assessing impact or effectiveness is that the success stories may be very clear, like Mr. Sheikh, who you may have seen give evidence yesterday, but the failures where somebody hasn't been referred, or where they haven't consented to participate, or where they've dropped out of a program, or where they've completed a program but they've feigned compliance, are, I suggest, impossible to measure.
Can you say that again, please?
The success stories, like Mr. Sheikh yesterday, are very visible, they're very identifiable. The failures where a extremist has not ever been referred into a program, or has refused to consent with a voluntary program so they don't engage with it, or they drop out halfway through, or they complete the program and feign compliance so they don't change their conduct. Those categories of people, what I'm describing as the failures, as a practical reality is going to be impossible to measure, isn't it?
But when you say failure in what way? Because if they're, what do you mean? You say they go on to commit an attack. Is that what you're suggesting? Or they recidivate? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting people who may be appropriately put into a program because they may present a risk, but do not go through that process successfully for some reason. That is an impossible metric to measure, practically speaking.
Yeah, but they may have, but the simple process of having contact may shift their behaviour. We may never know about it, right? I don't think it's impossible. I wouldn't agree with that assertion. It's impossible to measure. You can still measure disguised compliance in relation to behaviours as being the opposite of the intervention plan, right? So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that statement. I mean, yeah.
Well, one way in which one could measure success, and in fact you've said at paragraph 58 that an important measure of success would be longitudinal evidence.
Correct.
What are the longitudinal indicators that you have in mind?
Well, sustained pro-social activities. It could be, lack of recidivism, lack of re-engagement with extremist content. There's a whole bunch of stuff around re-engagement you could look at. But really, sustained pro-social activities would be one longitudinal measure.
Another one might be engagement with a stable employment situation.
Oh, absolutely, yep. Interfaith engagement and dialogue, yep.
Now, those aren't matters that are currently recorded in the PIRA database, are they?
No, we don't measure those sort of. You'd have to do that. You're going to need access to closed source data, and you're going to need access to the intervention data, and then we would need to match that by some of the cases. We don't have that. We're just simply looking at risk factors. We do look at, there is an indicator around disengagement, but it's very weak because of the indicators we're relying upon.
The longitudinal indicators that you raised aren't recorded in the Australian Support and Intervention caseload system either, are they?
NSIP, not that I'm aware of. But that doesn't say that's, but in saying that, I mean, there is the ACL Allen evaluation going on, and I'm pretty sure, if my memory is correct, the contract is till 2028, I think. My memory is correct, so look, that may be an outcome of that evaluation, right?
Is that the evaluation of client change, which is part of the evaluation framework?
Yeah, so there is in the ACL, and some of the documents I read in the ACL and evaluation, they do use some, well, like one of them uses our metric, which was nice, okay? Some of them do, they do use, they are trying to develop particular types of metrics to look at the intervention programs. Also CISP also uses the PIN model. They got a very interesting approach that the VU people took, looking at the domains around the proactive intervention model indicators, looking at change over time. They did something quite interesting in relation to the CISP evaluation, which I think could provide some learnings.
Do you know whether those pieces of evidence that are being gathered now are long-term longitudinal indicators or short-term after the end of the program?
I'm not 100% sure. I know the ACL and the evaluation is going to 2028, but it's really about what the ultimate outcome of those evaluations will be in relation to embedding measures within the program themselves. You would hope that if that's going to occur, then that's a good outcome.
Do you agree that one way of improving the evidence about long-term success stories through consideration of longitudinal indicators would be for programs to have a formal framework for periodic review after the completion of the program?
Yes, it would. And you mean after individual completion?
Yes.
Yes, it would, and that does occur. The documentations I saw, when a person is coming up for exit, they're reviewing and examining all their previous. It's not like, you know, the process of client exit isn't spontaneous, right? It's not like they all reach a certain point, and then they're released. But you know, there is an ongoing progress of review to get to that point about whether a client should or should not be exited from the program, and when they're ready. That was amongst some of the documentation that I saw.
But what I'm asking about is the period after they exit the program.
Oh, you mean follow-up?
Yes.
Yeah, ideally follow-up would be good, some term of follow-up with clients longitudinally in the community. Post-exit follow-up is always worthwhile in the context of ensuring the change process is sustained and maintained over time, yes. But in I think in a number of the submissions, there was talk about post-exit follow-up, but it's really one of capacity and resourcing, right, around that question. So it's an easy recommendation to make. The next question is there the resourcing to do it adequately?
Are you aware that in the UK system there is a formal framework under their Act for people who complete programs or even refuse to consent to enter into the Channel program to follow up on them after defined periods?
I'm not aware of that. No, that's new information to me. I wasn't aware of that.
Would that be a useful framework to incorporate into Australian programs?
I would want to know if it's effective. I would know what the pros and cons are. I would want to know about the consequences, unintended consequences. I can't answer that with a yes or no. I can't respond with yes or no. You got to know. You would have to know the benefits, the drawbacks, the consequences, how long follow-up occurs. Is it useful under one context? There's a whole bunch of considerations around whether such approach would have some utility here.
One benefit, I suggest, would be that it would make it easier to collect the kind of longitudinal data that you consider to be important to measure the success of a program. Do you agree with that?
Oh, it might. I can't. I would have to know more about what that looks like to really answer that question appropriately.
And another benefit...
Sorry to interrupt. because my answer would be pure speculation, right?
And another benefit would be that having some institutional follow-up within a formal framework would, all else being equal, be better than simply having someone drop off the radar and never checked in on again, wouldn't it?
I think some formal follow-up would be useful, but you've got to remember at some point we've got to let go, right? You know, you've got to let go.
But I suggest that point should not simply be the point at which they end the program or they refuse to participate.
There could be follow-up over a certain number of months, but you can't, you know, these people have exited the program, you can't expect this sort of follow-up and monitoring to occur over their whole lifetime.
I'm not suggesting that.
At some point it's like, okay, you could have a period under which follow-up and monitoring might occur, but at some point it's like, okay, you know, it's like your adult child. You just got to, you're on your merry way.
As I understand it, Professor, you and Mr. Bender are not at odds on that. His point is there might be value to follow up after exit, after a prescribed time.
After prescribed time, that is correct. I would agree with that. That is true. Yes, but I would, again, I would not, the period of time is critical because you've got to let these people get on with their lives at some point.
But say a period of after 12 months, that would be a reasonable point at which to check in to see how somebody's going, wouldn't it?
Look, it might be. Yeah, I mean, it could have some utility, but again, that answer is just speculation without knowing the detail of what that post-monitoring actually looked like. Yes, it could have benefit, but my answer is purely speculative.
Lastly, you referred to the possibility of referral to police or other authorities when somebody presents into a program. That might be particularly relevant if they refuse to consent, might it?
Sorry, say it at the start again.
There's if somebody presents to a CVE program, or is referred, I should say, to a CVE program and then refuses to participate, in some cases it might be appropriate for that person or the authorities to be notified in some way about the risk presented by that person, correct?
But it depends on the type of risk. I wouldn't say that's a blanket requirement for every individual. It depends on the type of risk that is being that is presenting. So it's not simply yes or no. Depends on the type of risk and what behaviours they are manifesting. For some, you know, you've got to remember, simply being approached may be the trigger. I better do things differently, right? Okay, so for others,
in some cases, if somebody is presenting to a program because they're referred and they refuse to consent and they present an obvious risk of violence or crime or something else, it could be appropriate for them to be referred to the police. And I think in your evidence, you referred to that as an individual decision to be made based on the structural professional judgment of the person in the program.
That's true, but I want to qualify that about it depends on the type of risk they're presenting. Obviously, if you have an individual that is communicating threat or behavioural intent, it would make sense, right? Or someone who has a history of violence. Yes, it does make sense, but it depends on the type of risk being presented. I don't want my answer to leave the impression it's just a blanket, it should always apply.
Nobody is suggesting that, Professor. Would there be benefit in having, particularly in light of your concern about there being no blanket requirement, would there be a benefit in there being some written down formal framework as to when somebody should be notified to the authorities by a program in that scenario?
You mean like a criteria under which agencies should follow? The agencies should follow when they notify other.
Some guidelines that might be taken into account in a uniform way by programs in Australia in that scenario.
Can you please ask your question again?
When somebody is referred to a program and they refuse to participate, but somebody working in the program forms the view that they present a risk of violence, would it be useful for there to be a formal framework that gives guidance to CVE programs as to when and how reporting to the authorities ought to occur?
Yes, that sounds reasonable enough. But again, we have to be careful what the implication for the individual itself, particularly if it's a young person, right? It would be useful. I think those criteria would have to be fairly tight around the threshold.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes. Yes, Mr. Milliken.
I haven't sought leave, but with your leave, there was one matter I did wish to raise. Thank you, Commissioner. Professor Cherney, my name is Peter Milliken. I appear for the Commonwealth in this matter. You gave evidence in response to some questions earlier about radicalisation pathways being triggered by external events, and you gave the example of a passport cancellation. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you made it clear that you weren't commenting on the legitimacy of the decision to cancel the passport, but you identified that as something that might be a trigger for radicalisation.
That's correct. I mean, the triggering events, again, I'm not making, when we talk about triggering events, we're not making a judgment call around those events. It's how they're interpreted, right?
I understand. And I take it that you would accept that the government might cancel a person's passport because they are radicalised, and their continued possession of the passport might pose a risk to security for Australia or another country?
Oh, of course. It would make sense in that circumstances to do that.
Yes, and those decisions are often made on the basis of advice from ASIO, for example.
Correct.
You'd be aware.
That's correct. I know that, yes.
And of course, I take it you would accept that cancelling a person's passport might in fact divert them from a radicalisation pathway if they were intending to, for example, travel to the or to Syria to join the Islamic State.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, where are some cases of Yes, I would agree with that statement. You are correct that the act of cancelling a passport may lead to a person to think twice about what they intended or what they thought, etc. So yeah, it would have some utility. But in the PIRA, we're talking about, in our PIRA data set, okay, we're not making a judgment call around the legitimacy of those decisions. We're understanding they could be quite legitimate. Passport cancellation. Here we're trying to understand, was there a triggering event that led to the escalation, for the individual that we can trace back to? It's the reaction to the triggering event that matters, not the legal or political foundation of the decision, etc. I'm not making any statement around that.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes. Anything arising, Ms Hager?
No, and Commissioner, given how the evidence has played out, I've now revisited the need for a closed session and decided that I don't need to ask questions in a closed session.
Yes, very well. In that case, thank you very much for your evidence, Professor Cherney. You are excused.
So, thank you.
Feel free to leave the witness box. Thank you.
Sorry?
Feel free to leave the witness box, is all I was saying.
Yes.
No worries.
Thank you, Professor. At that point, Commissioner, there are two matters that remain for today, one of which is the tendering of a list of documents that has been circulated to the parties with leave, as I understand it.
Yes.
And I tender the documents on that list.
Yes.
Which don't
Very
currently
well.
have particular exhibit numbers, but will be given those in due course.
Yes. All right. The documents on the list that has been circulated will, in each instance, be received as an exhibit.
And then finally, Commissioner, there was a video that's due to be played of some pre-recorded evidence from an individual who is known by a pseudonym ADE.
Yes, I think what happened was ADE gave evidence in a closed session, but part of that evidence is assessed as being able to be given in public. It having been recorded, the proposition now is that we will play it.
That's correct, Commissioner.
Yes, yes, very well.
Reference to her second statement, and just with a view to it perhaps being able to be given publicly, I might very briefly